Well, quantum computing is top of mind in Illinois as the annual Chicago Quantum Exchange kicks off today. You might be asking yourself, what exactly is quantum computing?
It uses quantum science to solve problems faster than a normal computer. Illinois has made major investments to make the land of Lincoln the land of quantum. Capitol Bureau Chief Max Cotton takes a look at how Illinois is turning into this quantum hub.
Governor Pritzker had a lot to celebrate Monday at the Chicago Quantum Exchange Summit.
Here in the Midwest, we believe that quantum science and research are on an accelerating timeline. And as governor, I want to make sure that we are focused on bringing opportunity and history-making innovations to the people of the United States and the world as soon as we can.
Since taking office, Pritzker has made it a priority to turn Illinois into quantum Silicon Valley.
Talented scientists and engineers, startup capital, growth stage capital, world-class modern facilities, visionary entrepreneurs, spaces designed for collaboration, universities and national laboratories, and of course a government that's either directly supportive or getting the heck out of the way.
And those efforts are paying dividends, as Pritzker signed legislation earlier this year to create a quantum enterprise zone, which includes a $500 million investment into a quantum computing campus that'll house a quantum proving ground. The state is partnering with the U.S. Department of Defense's Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, to create the proving ground, with each investing an additional $140 million.
This industry, this ecosystem, and the many causes that will benefit from it have the potential to bring untold economic prosperity, tens of thousands of jobs and billions in private investment capital directly into our communities.
In total, the governor's office estimates the quantum enterprise zone could attract as much as $11 billion in federal money and $20 billion in private investment. In Springfield, Max Cotton, WGEM News.
Now, in July, Pritzker announced the quantum zone will be built in Chicago on the former home of the U.S. Steel site.